Good morning. This is Pastor Barbara, aka Preacher with Parrots. In addition to doing this video for YouTube, we're also live on iblog.tv. Sunday mornings, our messages are whatever the Lord leads us to speak about. And this morning, it's going to be a two-part, possibly three, but I think two-part message from the book of Daniel. Today is the 12th of July, and I'm going to read actually from the Kids Study Bible, the NIV, from the second chapter of Daniel. On Sunday nights, we speak from the New Testament, and on Wednesday nights, we're in the Old Testament. In the Old Testament on Wednesday, we're studying the divided kingdom. We had first the kingdom of Saul, and then David, and then Solomon. And after Solomon's reign ended, the kingdom was divided into two. The northern kingdom was made up of 10 tribes, and the southern kingdom was made up of 2. In the northern kingdom, zero kings worshipped God. Therefore, none of the kings ever led the people toward serving God, and they became so corrupt that the northern tribes, the northern kingdom, ceased to exist, and they became captives of Assyria. The southern kingdom continued for a few more kings, a few more years. And while they had a few kings in their history that served God, those latter ones did not. And they wound up in pretty much the same situation that the northern kingdom did. And they found themselves in captivity to Babylon. And that's where our lesson begins today. There is no more northern kingdom. There is only the 2 tribes of Judah and Benjamin in the southern kingdom. They are not serving God. He is no longer their protector. He had told them many years before, if you serve me, I will be your God, you will be my people, I will take care of you. If you don't serve me, you're on your own. I'm not going to do some terrible thing to you because you're not serving me. But if you do something you need to be punished for, I'll allow your enemies to punish you. And this was the state that Israel was in, where today's lesson begins. The temple in Jerusalem was destroyed by King Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, which at that time covered what we know as Iraq. Later we're going to talk about Persia, which covers the real estate or the territory that we now know as Iran. But what we're talking about today actually happened in what we now know as Iraq. There was a king. He was the king of the most powerful kingdom that existed at that time known as Babylon. We're going to start in the second chapter. The first chapter just tells about the people arriving in captivity. Now, there's a difference between captivity and slavery. When Israel were slaves in Egypt, and God used Moses to bring them out of slavery and into a land that he gave them, which we call Israel. They were slaves. They were not free. They worked. They did what they were told. They didn't get paid for it. They had no freedom of choice. They couldn't leave the country without permission. They were slaves. Well, now they're in captivity, which is a little different from slavery. They could start a business and make money. They could have children. They could raise their family. They could teach their kids a trade. The only thing they weren't free to do was leave Babylon. They were captives. In the first chapter of Daniel, we have the information given to us that they came, they were in Babylon, and Nebuchadnezzar noticed that some of these young Jewish men were very bright. See, we have an extra guest that's popped in. I will chat with you all later, and we have an extra member, Herod. Boy, that's one I haven't seen before. Is this the first time you've been in my program? I'm going to call you Peril. First time. Well, I hope you enjoy yourself. I'm not going to chat too much until after I get through teaching today's lesson. And at the same time, I'm making a video for YouTube. So that's the reason. But if you'd like to hang around and chat some later, or if you have questions or comments, we'll be happy to do that after the end of our lesson. We're just starting the lesson now. So, King Nebuchadnezzar notices that there's a young man by the name of Daniel that's quite bright. Now, Daniel, I think, was in his early teens, probably around 14. There are 3 other men. Sometimes they use their Babylonian name, sometimes they use their Jewish name. But their names were Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. At the beginning of the book of Daniel, which is a prophetic book, and that's the fact that it's a prophetic book is the reason we're studying it today. We're going to find out that, and the reason I've chosen this particular book, is that the king has a dream that he doesn't remember. So he wants a prophet not only to tell him what the dream meant, but what the dream was. The reason I've chosen this particular story for today is somebody comes and tells you this is, whether they're a politician, whether they're running for office, whether they're a preacher, whether there's somebody with an idea of something they think is going to happen in the future. It's sort of an unproven idea that they have. But if somebody tells you something's going to happen in great detail, and it turns out that it happens in great detail, exactly as it was. And we've done another school, boy, somebody else is visiting my program for the first time. Welcome. We'll chat after today's lesson if you're still here and so inclined. Things that were told by Daniel in great detail about a particular country came to pass. See, this is old history. This is not New Testament. This is not the end of the Old Testament. This is old history. So what was prophesied that was going to happen, it actually has happened. Now, 5 things were prophesied. 4 of them have, oh, you're new to the community. Well, I hope you enjoy the community, and I hope you enjoy our program. 5 things were prophesied. 4 have already come to pass. Now, if we're talking about somebody that has given a prophecy before, and it comes true, every single last detail they said would happen, happened exactly like they said it would. And then they prophesy something else. And that happens exactly as they said it would, down to the last detail. And it's not yet time for the 5th thing to happen, but of the first 4, they've all come true exactly like they should. This person, I would believe, that's one of the younger birds. This one that's flapping his wings is about 7 weeks old and hasn't had a lot of experience flying or flapping the wings, and that's why he's making so much noise. Well, let's get to the actual prophecy. In the 2nd year of Nebuchadnezzar's rule, Nebuchadnezzar was the king. His kingdom, he has just destroyed the temple in Jerusalem. He has just taken all of the people that lived in Jerusalem. They have destroyed the walls which made a city safe. They've destroyed many of the homes and the temple. The people have all been carted off to live in Babylon, which is what we now call Iraq. This is the 2nd year he's king. He has the largest, the greatest, the most powerful kingdom on earth at this time. His mind was troubled and he couldn't sleep. So he sent for those who claimed to have knowledge, for the wise men. We know about the wise men that came to visit Jesus when he was born. They came, some of them, close to 1,000 miles. They came from Iraq and Iran all the way to Israel on foot or on camel. So it took them between 1 year and 2 years to make the trip. All countries had wise men. They had people who were knowledgeable about science, what knowledge was available to know then. They were knowledgeable about science. They were knowledgeable in what we call the black arts. Fortune telling, languages, history. You may not remember this detail, but when the wise men that came from the east to visit Jesus, they stopped off and they talked to King Herod, figuring, well, if a king has been born, who is going to be the person most knowledgeable about this? Of course, it's going to be king, somebody who is king. Well, Herod hasn't heard anything about it. So what does Herod do? Herod calls for his wise men. And he said, okay, wise men, you know everything about everything. tell me, where is a baby king born around here and around this time? Where does King Herod's wise men go, since they know everything about everything? What one wise man doesn't know, another wise man does. So where does Herod get the information to give to the wise men who come to see Jesus? They go to the Old Testament and they find this was in what we would call 4 years before Christ on the Gregorian calendar. At that time, it was considered the year in which Christ was born, but then they found a mistake in the calendar. Pope Gregory did, and so we're in the Gregorian calendar, and we have this ridiculous idea that Christ was born 4 years before the birth of Christ, which doesn't make sense, but it's the only thing they could come up with to make a correction in what was then a worldwide mistake in the calendar. Okay, they check, and it says that a baby will be born in the city of David in Bethlehem. And they give them directions to Bethlehem. So even in the New Testament, when Rome was the world power, they had wise men. So Nebuchadnezzar calls his wise men. And he says, okay, I have a dream that I need interpreted. However, I can't even remember the dream. You know, I think he was really sincere. I think he really forgot his dream. The Bible says he forgot it, so he must have forgotten it. But it would have been a smart thing to do, even if he wasn't smart. Because if you tell somebody, I had a dream, and in my dream I saw this, and this happened, and somebody said the other, anybody can make up anything they want to, right? Just make something up. You've been given a story, just make up a meaning. But he couldn't even remember the dream. So they couldn't say, well, when you saw this, it meant that. Because he couldn't even tell them the dream. Now, in the 2nd chapter of Daniel, he is telling all of his wise men, of which Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were 4 of them, that he was going to kill them all off. All these wise men, if they couldn't tell him what his dream meant, they were dead. At the time that this happened in history, there was nobody more powerful than him. He could make rules, he could break rules, he could do what he wanted to do. There was no such thing as, well, the king can't kill people off. Yeah, he could. The king could do at this time, and we're going to see that the power begins to diminish with each consecutive kingdom. But he could do whatever he wanted. So those who studied the heavens, that is, those who studied stars and moon and the sun, they spoke in Aramaic. And they said, "Oh, King Nebuchadnezzar, live forever. Tell us what you dreamed and we'll tell you what it means." And he said, "I made up my mind. You must tell me what I dreamed. And you must tell me what it means. And if you don't, I'll cut you in pieces." Now, this is a more modern version. Let me read here's one that's not quite that modern. This one is about 40 years old. 44. I tell you the dream is gone. I can't remember it. And if you won't tell me what it means, I'll have you torn limb from limb. And your houses will be made into heaps of rubble. That's what's going to happen if you don't tell me what my dream means. If you do, I'll give you wonderful gifts and honors. So get busy, tell me what it means. And they said to him, how can we tell you if you don't tell us? You have to tell us the dream, and then we'll tell you what it means. And the king said, I see your trick. You're stalling for time until some calamity happens. And whatever the dream is foretelling will happen. And then you'll know because you'll see it happen. But if you can't tell me the dream, how am I expected to believe in your interpretation? That's pretty smart. He really did forget the dream. But if he hadn't, it would have been a smart trick. Because they could just make up anything. But since whatever they're going to tell him is either going to remind him of the dream or it's not. If they make up a dream, it's not going to happen. Because he will either remember that that was his dream or he'll remember that it wasn't his dream. The Chaldeans said to him, there isn't a man alive who can tell you what you dream. And there isn't a king in all the world that would expect us to. This is an impossible thing the king is requiring. Nobody except the gods. That's a small g. Not meaning the true God, but a God. Not even a God could tell you your dream. And they're not here to help. So the king was furious. And he decided he was going to execute. He was going to kill all of his wise men. And Daniel and his companions, that would be Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they handled the situation with great wisdom. They said, why is the king angry? What's his problem? So Daniel went to see the king, and Daniel talked the king into giving him a little bit more time. Why did Daniel need time? Daniel needed time so that he and the other 3 Jews, believers in God, could pray and ask for God's help. So, they went home, and they asked the God of heaven to show them his mercy by telling them the secret, so that they would not die with the others. And that night in a vision, God told Daniel what the king had dreamed. He actually dreamed of 5 coming his kingdom and 4 others. So the dream that God gave the king, now God gives Daniel. So now Daniel dreams what the king has dreamed. And Daniel praised God and said, blessed be the name of God forever. World events are under his control. He removes kings and he sets other kings on their thrones. In other words, if you're a king, it's because God allows you to become king. And if you're not a king, it's because God hasn't made you a king. Kings don't just happen. If somebody is a king, even if they're not a believer in God, if they're a king, it's because God has allowed it. And if they're not, it's because God hasn't allowed it. He gives wise men their wisdom. He said, those of us who are wise, we weren't just born smart. God gave us wisdom. He knows hidden things. Then Daniel went in to see the one that was in charge of killing off all the wise men. And he said, don't kill them. Take me to the king and I'll tell him what he wants to know. So they take Daniel in before the king. And they say, we found one of your Jewish captives, not a Babylonian, but a Jew. They're in Jerusalem, where you destroyed their temple and destroyed the wall around their city and destroyed some of the houses. One of those young men says he's got the answer you're looking for. And the king said, is it true? Can you tell me, number one, what my dream was, and number two, what it means? And Daniel does something that we find them doing in the New Testament a lot. Every time the Apostle Paul has to show up in front of a judge or a king or a ruler, he gives a chance to give his testimony. Well, here Daniel, he's now in front of the king, and he's going to take an opportunity to give a testimony, say something about God. And Daniel said, no wise man, no astrologer, no magician, no wizard can tell the king these things. But there is a God in heaven who reveals secrets. And he has told you in your dream what the future holds. And this is what the future holds. Let me get a little bit of my special drink, right? 1 cup of decaf and 1 cup of hot chocolate and 1 big old dollop of cream. And that's how I start out every morning. Whoops. Got a pile of Bibles here. He said, this was your dream. You dreamed of coming events. Hang on. I may have just lost. No, apparently not. I lost on my screen what I was recording. But the camera was on, and regardless of what was on my screen, we didn't really lose anything. So I was prepared to start again, but I won't need to. It said you dreamed of coming events. He who revealed secrets was speaking to you. God is talking to you. Who else would know? But remember, this is Daniel. It's not because I'm wiser than any living person that I know the secret of your dream. I know the secret of your dream because God gave it to me. And God showed it to me so that I could tell it to you, and it will benefit you, King. What I'm going to tell you is for your own benefit. You saw a huge, powerful statue of a man. It was shining brilliantly. It was frightening and terrible. Not terrible in a bad sense, but like, wow. The head of the statue was made of pure gold, and the chest and arms were of silver, the belly and thighs of brass, legs of iron, and the feet were part iron and part clay. I'm going to read a couple more sentences, and then I'm going to get out the picture of this statue. As you watched, because he's looking at a statue. The statue is made of 4 different metals until the very end, and then clay is thrown in, which isn't a metal. As you watched, a rock was cut out of the mountainside by supernatural means. It came hurtling down the statue and crushed the feet of iron and clay, smashing them into bits. Now, let me get a picture of this. Here is one of the pictures and an explanation along with it. The head, it's a statue. The head is made of gold. The chest and the arms are made of silver. The thigh and the belly are made of brass. The legs are made of iron, and the feet are a combination of iron and clay. This is talking about 5 different kingdoms. The first one is the one that is happening at the time that he has this dream, Babylon. He is the king of Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar was. Of the 4 metals that I've mentioned, gold is the softest, and it's the most valuable. You don't buy a necklace of iron. You don't buy a bracelet of brass. If you want something that's valuable, you want it as pure gold as possible. However, of these 4 metals, gold is the softest. When I was a young woman, and you know, your boyfriends buy you jewelry, the gold rings or bracelets or watch bands that a boyfriend or a husband would buy a young woman were 14 karat gold. If it was any more gold than 14 karat, it was too soft. Later, when I was working as a court interpreter, I started buying occasionally jewelry off the television set, Home Shopping Club, and it was 18 karat gold. That gold is too soft. You could actually, if you wanted to, you could bend it. So the most precious, the most valuable is the head of gold, but it is the softest metal of those that are up there. The next one is silver. That's the next most valuable as far as what it's worth in money. Notice that there are 2 arms. With the head we have just 1, with the belly we have 1, the legs are considered 1, but with the arms we've got 2. Because it wasn't going to be just Persia, it was going to be Medes and Persians. The next kingdom is going to be the kingdom of Greece. and it's going to be brass. It is harder than silver. It is less valuable than silver. And then we come to the legs of iron. If you want something that is strong, that will hold a lot of weight, that will do a lot of work, you want iron. It has no value. You don't make jewelry out of iron. So it has no, it's not worth a lot of money, but it's very strong. All of these represent kingdoms that are now history. The very last one is the feet. And that's a combination of two things. It's a combination of the iron that was in the legs and clay. Well, first of all, iron and clay doesn't mix. You can take metals and heat them and make them into liquid, and you can, to a degree, you can mix some metals with other metals. But you know what clay is. Clay is like mud. You can't take mud and heat it and turn it into liquid and then take iron and turn it into liquid and mix it and then let it get hard. Because what happens? Clay is not liquid. Oh, it will find its way in liquid, but there's no strength to it. You set it a little bit crooked on its side or whatever, and it's going to come apart. There's no strength there. He's talking about the head represents the Babylonian kingdom. The king had so much power, there was nobody that could stop him from doing anything he wanted. Absolutely nobody. He wasn't given power by the United Nations. He wasn't given power by a great army that he had. He had this all-powerful position. We're going to talk about his kingdom this morning. And then next Sunday, we're going to talk about Persia, Greece, and Rome. And maybe the feet of clay and iron. We're going to see that each thing that was prophesied came to pass exactly as it was prophesied that it would. And this is my point. If I were to meet somebody today, if I were to go down to the village to have lunch, and I would meet somebody in a restaurant, and they would say, well, I'm a prophet. I can tell you what's going to happen tomorrow. Okay. I'd listen to them. Maybe I'd believe them. Maybe I wouldn't. It would depend on how outrageous they were. But I would have no reason to either believe or disbelieve them. But if I met the same person tomorrow, and everything they told me came true, and then they tell me another story, and they say, this is what's going to happen tomorrow, and it happens, by the time they gave me 4 stories, and everything they said came true to the last detail and to the last point, I'd be very likely to believe their fifth story. And because we can go to our history books, not prophecy books, not something that hasn't happened yet, but we can go to history. I lived through the Great Depression, and I lived through the Second World War. I was 14 years old, and about 6 to 8 weeks into after my 14th birthday, that the Second World War ended. I remember the day I got my driver's license on my 14th birthday, and I wasn't a very good driver. We lived in a city. It wasn't like you could go off someplace in a huge parking lot like you can now and teach your kid how to drive. And the parking lot is so big that you can reach over and stop the car before the kid can do too much damage. I really wasn't a very good driver to be living in Detroit where there was a lot of traffic. And my dad called me and he said, the war just ended. Get in the car and get over here. I used to get off the school bus at his business, pick up the car, do whatever he wanted me to do or whatever my mother wanted done. And it was time for him to close his business. I'd go pick him up. But he said, get the car here. We lived just under 1 mile from his business. He said, in another 5 minutes, it will be impossible to drive on the road. And we lived on 13 Mile Road, a very, very busy road. In Detroit, you have 5 Mile Road, 6 Mile Road, 7 Mile Road, 8 Mile. All those mile roads are very busy. And I had to back from a residence into a very busy road and go down to the corner of Woodward Avenue, where if you know anything about Detroit, that is the main road. And I couldn't drive very well. I lived through that history. I remember every detail of some of the things that happened. So Babylon is history. It's Iraq now. After Babylon comes a prophecy of what will happen when the Medes and the Persians, there were two, we have two arms. One represented the Medes, one represented the Persians. There were more Persians and they were stronger. It just so happened, and we'll get to it today, that when the kingdom of Babylon ended, that the Medes were right there at the palace. They were not the strongest, they were not the most important, but they were there at the time that the king died. That's when the handwriting on the wall came out. That was a very important, they happened to be right there. And they came under the wall and got in the palace. So there were two, the Medes and the Persians. And Medes was known as Medo. After them came the Greeks. After the Greeks, it was while the Greeks were the world power that the Olympics started. When we go through the Olympic Games, they give you some number like the 30th or the 40th or whatever Olympic game, but this was the reorganized because during World War II, there were no Olympic Games, and they started counting again. But the Olympic Games, as we know them, especially the running and the foot races, and that part of the Olympics, not so much with the boats and the bicycles and the games, but the running and those particular skills, those all came into being during this particular time that the Greeks were in charge. And then more or less 50 years before the birth of Christ, the Greeks went out of power and the Romans came in. And everything we read in the New Testament is about the Romans, because the Romans were then a world power. The language was Greece. The Greeks had a better language, more precise. They were more skillful. And so, because they were superior, many Greek things were still around when the Roman government was a world power. And that was just a few years. Let me go over the dates. We are studying on Wednesday night. We are between 500 and 600 years before Christ. Well, Babylon, whoops, I just lost, here we go. Babylon was between 605 years before Christ is when it started. And they went out of power. The numbers get smaller because they're going toward the birth of Christ. We're going away from the birth of Christ, so the numbers get bigger. Last year was 2014. This year is 2015. Then we'll go to 2016. The numbers get bigger now because we're going away from the birth of Christ. But this was going to the birth of Christ, so the numbers get smaller. So between 605 and 539 was Babylon. Before I get through today, we'll talk about what happened in 539. Then from 539 to 531, only existed for 8 years. But that's when the Persians were in power. From 331 to 168, over a couple hundred years, the Greeks were in power. After them came Rome. And this has BC 168 to 476. That should be backward. I don't know why they have it that way in this particular thing that I'm looking at. So of the 5 kingdoms, 4 have already happened. The Roman Empire was in effect until after Christ, 476 years. So at the time Christ was born, until after his death and resurrection and ascension into heaven, and for another 400 years, the Roman government did not rule the world, but they were the most powerful government. Well, we were given 5 different kingdoms. One is a combination of the old Roman government, which was legs made out of iron, and clay. A mixture of 2 things that don't mix. And that is a kingdom which is yet to come. Let me share with you the end of that kingdom. And it talks about this same statue. There is going to be a rock. A rock that is actually a piece of the mountain that's pulled out. And this rock comes tumbling down the mountain And this rock hits the statue. And it breaks the statue. And the statue falls down. And that is the end of one kingdom and the beginning of another. Actually, I could have said that a little bit better. All right, let me go back now to what I was reading. Daniel starts out with his testimony. Daniel said there's nobody alive that could tell you, king, what your dream was. But the only reason I know what it is because God has told me. He said he gives wise men their wisdom. He gives scholars their intelligence. He reveals profound mysteries beyond what a man can understand. He says, King, you saw a huge and powerful statue of a man. The head was gold. The chest and arms were silver. The belly and thighs were brass. The legs were iron. The feet were part iron and part clay. And you watched, and a rock was cut out of the mountainside. By supernatural means. It just suddenly was there. There was nobody with equipment digging it out. It just supernaturally, suddenly, this piece of the mountainside, this rock appeared. Then the whole statue collapsed into a heap of iron, clay, brass, silver, and gold. Everything on the statue. The head collapsed, the shoulders collapsed, the belly of brass. It was all there laying together in a heap. Your Majesty, you're a king over many kings. And the reason that you're a king is because God gave you that position of king. You rule the farthest provinces. Your kingdom goes way beyond Babylon. Way, way, way beyond Egypt. Way past Europe. You are the head of gold. Your dream was the statue. Now we're talking about what the dream means. You, king, are the head of gold. But after your kingdom ends, and that's where we're going to end this morning's message, when your kingdom ends, another one will come into power. And that one will be inferior to yours. Oh, it'll be a strong kingdom, but not as strong as yours was. And after that one, there'll be another one. And that one will be inferior. And that's the bronze belly of the statue. And it will rise to rule the world. Greece will rise and will rule the world. And following that is a fourth kingdom. Strong as iron. Stronger than gold. Not as precious as gold, but stronger. Following that, the fourth kingdom will be as strong as iron, smashing, bruising, conquering, The feet and the toes that you saw, part iron and part clay, show that later on, these first kingdoms are going to be one right after the other. But as far as the feet of iron and clay, that will be a divided kingdom. And you know, anything divided is not strong. Some parts of it will be as strong as iron. Now, this one isn't history yet. We have had the Babylonian kingdom. We have had the Medes and the Persians. We have had the Greeks. We have had the Romans. We have not yet had the combination of the iron and clay feet. This mixture of iron and clay shows that these kingdoms will try to strengthen themselves by forming alliances with each other through intermarriage of their rulers. But this will not succeed, for iron and clay don't mix. We still, through today, well, let's go back to, remember the downfall of Solomon was his many wives who served false gods. Hi, DJ Ryan, I just noticed you on my chat box. I'm working on 2 computers at the same time. Glad to see you here. I hope you're still around when I get through with this lesson and we can chat. But anyway, welcome, and I'm glad you're here. Now, iron and clay not only don't mix, they don't make sense. But he's saying the reason they don't make sense is because they don't mix. And the downfall of this final kingdom is going to be, you're going to try to make the kingdom strong by marriages. And have you noticed that there are some countries that still have monarchies? England is one. Now, whether there's any power in the monarchy or whether the government really has the power for Great Britain is, I guess, a matter of who you are and how you look at the situation. As far as the countries that preceded this, there were many, and there still are today. Somebody, they may not be as high up in the monarchy as king and queen and prince and princess, but they do marry into a quasi-monarchy. He says, during the reigns of those kings, Babylon, Medes and Persians, Greeks, and Romans, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that will never be destroyed. All of these other kingdoms have been destroyed. Rome destroyed itself. That's real smart, isn't it? Rome set itself on fire. And he said, no one will ever conquer or destroy that last kingdom because it will not be set up by man. It will be set up by God. The meaning of the rock that, you know, just sort of spontaneously appeared, that was cut from the mountain without human hands, that rock crushed to power the iron, the brass, the clay, the silver, the gold, every metal that was in this statue is now laying in a heap on the ground. What was strong enough to knock out the Babylonian kingdom, the strongest one there ever was? What was so strong that it could do away with every other kingdom? It was a rock. It was the rock that hit the feet, that knocked over the statue, and all the different parts of metal that made up that statue are now laying in a heap. Thus the great God has shown what will happen in the future. This is the interpretation of your dream. And this is my description of it. Nebuchadnezzar fell to the ground before Daniel, and he worshipped him. And he commanded the people to offer sacrifices to burn and incense. And he said, "Truly, Daniel the king, your God is the God of all gods. He's the ruler of kings and the revealer of mysteries, because he told you this secret." Then the king made Daniel very great. He gave him costly gifts. He put him over a whole province in Babylon, and he made him chief of all the other wise men. So then Daniel requested that, along with the power and authority he was given, that some of them be given to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego as his assistants. That's the end of that particular chapter. We go on for a number of years with the kingdom of Babylon being the strongest. Now let me well, I want to read something to you. I want to talk about the second empire. The first one is going to come to an end. A man by the name of Cyrus, talking about, can you trust something that's been prophesied to you and it comes true, and then something else is prophesied to you and it comes true, and something else is prophesied and it comes true? Can you now put confidence and faith and trust into something that the Bible says is going to happen this way, and it did, and the Bible says it's going to happen this way, and it did, and the Bible says... Let's listen to some more stuff that happened regarding these kingdoms. The Medo and the Persians, they came and took over when the Babylonian government fell. What do we know about it falling? Well, after Nebuchadnezzar came Belshazzar. There were a number of things. I'm not teaching the book of Daniel now. I really want to talk about prophecy in general. So I'm not going to go into details, but I will go into details about the very last thing that happened to the Babylonian Empire when it ended. And 1 second after it ended, the government of the Medo-Persians began. What happened? Okay, after Nebuchadnezzar was Belshazzar, and then there was another one. It's a question as to whether he was a son or a grandson, because of the words which they used to refer to parents and grandparents. But let's talk about what happened on the very last day of this most powerful kingdom in all the world, the Babylonian kingdom. Belshazzar gave a party for 1,000 of his buddies. It really shows me that we've got a comment here. The person doesn't have a clue what's going on, because Christianity doesn't come into being for several hundred years. So somebody that makes a comment, hang on, let me check something. Okay. I think this is going to be rather interesting. You all have heard me say in the past that as soon as you take voice away from a person who hasn't anything intelligent to say, they leave. That happens, doesn't it? You don't have to kick anybody out. All you have to do is silence them, and they go. Because if you don't let somebody say something stupid, they have nothing left to say, and they leave. All right, getting back now to the Medo-Persian. The last thing I'm checking. Did I make a mistake? No, okay. The last thing that happened on the last day of the Babylonian Empire, hundreds of years before Christianity, Belshazzar gave a party and invited over 1,000 people. He thought it would be fun to go get some of the things from the temple that Nebuchadnezzar had destroyed. And they brought them these sacred vessels and things that were used in Jewish worship years before Christianity. And they put them in the same building where some of their quote-unquote gods, with a small g, were. They had had about enough booze to make them silly and ridiculous. And they thought, oh, wouldn't it be fun if we filled these sacred vessels with hang on, I'm expecting something, that's why I'm checking. I have no clue what's going on. Okay. Wouldn't it be fun if we took some sacred things from God's temple and filled them with booze and really finished getting smashed? So He sent for them. They brought the sacred, dedicated, sanctified vessels from the temple in Jerusalem, filled them up with booze, got good and drunk, and then something happened that was going to spell out the end of the kingdom and scared them half to death. They saw part of an arm, part of a hand. It wrote on the wall, Mene, Mene, Tekel, Upharsin. Yeah. What did that mean? And where was the rest of the body that this hand should have been connected to? Well, it's about that time that they, and hang on, it's about that time they think, we need a preacher. We need somebody that knows what's going on. And they remembered Daniel. They said, Daniel, we'll give you anything you want. We're going to give you jewelry. We're going to give you special robes to wear. We're going to just let you have anything you want. And Daniel said, no. What I'm going to tell you, I'm going to tell you. I don't want your jewelry. I don't want your robes. I don't want anything special. But I know the meaning of what's written on the wall. And he said, this is what is written. This is what it means. Now, at that time, in Babylon, some rivers had dried up. The palace was, this is what I'm telling you now is history. It's not in the Bible. It's in your history book. Some rivers had dried up. The palace of the most powerful kingdom on earth was considered to be unpenetrable, safe. You couldn't get in. But when a river dries up, what's left? What's left is a riverbed. No water in it, but where once there was water. And outside this strong palace was a now dry riverbed going underneath the ground of the walls of the palace. And there are no Persians around at the time, but there are some Medes who are sharing power with the Persians. Cyrus is the head Persian at this time, but this is one of the Medes. So at the same time that inside the palace we have Mene, Mene, Tekel, Upharsin being written by a hand on the wall, we have some Medes that are outside the palace walls, according to our history books. Mene, you've been weighed on the scale, and you come up short. Scale doesn't read what it's supposed to read. The full weight is not there. What can you do about it? Nothing. There's no time for you to put rocks in your pockets to weigh more. There's no time for you to eat. Somebody ate the other day, was it 68 hot dogs on the 4th of July? There's no time. You can't fix it. Time just ended for you. You've got a big problem, and you've got no time to fix your problem. Mene, tekel, upharsin. You've been weighed, and you're found wanting. This day, this moment, right now you're so smashed you don't know your middle name. You don't have the good sense to realize what you're going through right now. But as of right now, you are dead. And as of right now, there is no more Babylon. The strongest, the greatest, the head of gold, the smartest, the most powerful, the most valuable, it doesn't exist any longer. You think you are so smart? You're a dead man. That's how much power you have. Nothing. And that is when the Babylonian, represented on this statue by the head of gold, ended. And the one of silver with the two arms, because it's the Medes and the Persians, are now in power. Well, I mentioned how history tells us that the Medes were there and were able to get into a palace that was thought to be unable to be penetrated. But let's talk about the Persians. And the head of them was Cyrus. Now, he was only around for a few years. That kingdom did not remain in power for very long. But during the time they did, they fixed up everything that the Babylonians had done in destroying the palace, in destroying the temple, in destroying the city, in destroying the walls. First of all, we have something very interesting. Daniel, who was trusted by the leaders of Babylon, is now equally trusted by the leaders of this second kingdom. He was an advisor to the new Medo-Persian Empire. And this, by the way, is where Iran is now. Let me bring up some other information here just a moment. Isaiah and Jeremiah and Daniel, 3 different prophets, all talked about this new kingdom and the destruction of Babylon. God told Jeremiah that the period of time that the Jews would be in exile would be 70 years. God told this to Jeremiah. Jeremiah wrote it down, and Daniel, another prophet, read the prophet Jeremiah and realized that it was coming to an end. And in his mind, he started preparing for the end of one kingdom and the beginning of another. Ezra also wrote down. He's another prophet. He wrote down that the name of the man that would free the Jews would be Cyrus. The Jews were only in Babylon for 70 years. 100 years before Cyrus was ever born, a prophet wrote in Scripture that a man by the name of Cyrus, and he says, I'm telling you now in Scripture what his name is. The man isn't born yet. But I'm telling you now that the Jews will be in Babylon without the ability to leave, come and go as they wish. But a man by the name of Cyrus will make a decree allowing them to leave. 100 years after this was written, Cyrus was born. And a few years after that, he is now big in the Persian government. And he writes an order. The number of years that it will take many things to happen, the clock begins to run not when Cyrus takes over Persia, not when the Medes and the Persians take over from the Babylonians, but things that have happened and things that are yet to happen, which haven't happened yet. Now in the year 2015, they have not happened yet. The calendar that will determine when they happen began to run when Cyrus signed his name on the order. He made the order. The Jews may return. They didn't have to go back. Look, I'm 84. If I were living in Babylon, the Jews were there for 70 years. If I were 84, that would mean that I had gone to Babylon when I was 14, that I had lived for 14 years in Israel and for 70 years in Babylon. I don't think I'd want to march back to Jerusalem. I don't know that I'd feel up to it. They didn't have to go back. They had been allowed to have their own businesses, to do with whatever. Many of them chose not to go back. Many of them chose to stay right where they are. Some of them chose to leave there and go somewhere else. But the ability for the government which took over the Babylonian government, now the Medes and the Persians, They are now saying that previous order has no more power, has no more authority. The Jews may go back. Not only did Cyrus allow them to go back, he paid for workers to go back and do the work. He paid for the trees that would be purchased and cut down to rebuild the temple and the materials to rebuild the wall. He not only paid for all of that, when there were enemies who bothered the Jews on their way back and made their going back difficult, he intervened and made it possible for the Jews to return to Jerusalem. And not only that, he sent a builder and a priest. Nehemiah was the builder that was sent by Cyrus and paid by Cyrus and that kingdom. And in addition, since they had been 70 years without a temple, 70 years without a service, 70 years without going to church, to make sure they got it all right, he sent back a priest along with the builder to make sure that everything was done right and was done properly when they got back. And it was in record time that they were able to build a wall. First they had to build the wall that protected them. And they built it by building with one hand and a weapon in their other hand to protect themselves while they did that. This was absolutely amazing. And starting next Sunday, we'll take the remaining kingdoms and just go over them to show you that everything that was predicted would happen did happen, exactly as it said it would. And if somebody is going to tell me about 5 kingdoms, the Babylonians, the Medes and the Persians, the Greeks, and the Romans, and they get all the details right, and all those kingdoms have come and gone, and everything that was predicted would happen, happened. There's one more kingdom, and it hasn't come yet. There was a period of 490 years. All of those except for 7 years, has happened. From 490 years, 483 years have already happened, exactly as it said they would. I'm going to put my faith and confidence that the one who made the first 483 years happen exactly as it was predicted is going to be right on target for those last 7 years that will begin any day. A few years, many years, who can say? We know a great deal. We don't know it all. From what we know, it could be any day. From what we don't know, it could be a while. But the God who said in advance everything that would happen in the first 4 kingdoms, I trust that in the kingdom of the Son of God, when he comes back for his people, and when he comes back to set Jerusalem free, to intervene in that battle of Armageddon, and when we have 1,000 years of Christ's ruling from Jerusalem, I'm going to put my faith that just as they were absolutely right in every small detail of the first 4 kingdoms, they will be right on as we read in the same Bible and preach from the same Bible that it's going to happen then. I'm going to close our video for today, and then we'll perhaps chat a little about what we've just talked about. Until our next video, which will be tonight, blessings on you.